Okay, I've been working on something pretty cool actually to analyze how teams influence opponents' disposals. Now, this will be transferable to Draft Stars as well, and I'll also look to dig a bit deeper. Right now, I'm looking at all positions. I can switch out to defenders, midfielders, forwards, etc. So, what's going to happen is the first thing I'm going to do is just select the team. I'm going to pick Carlton. Why not? Okay. And let's talk about what we can see here. So, in this table, it shows all of Carlton's games, who they played against, where they played, and how many disposals they conceded to that opposition. And you can see that basically marked along here. The teams and the blue stacks are the disposals that they conceded. The orange line here is just the league disposal average, so you can see where they're sort of breaching that average and where they're going under it. Then got a bit more extra data here. So next thing I look at is opposition differential. What that means is you may have given up 349 disposals to Richmond, but what does that mean? Is Richmond a high disposal team or is Richmond a low disposal team? Does that mean you defended tightly or that they just don't get many disposals? So we can see in round one, the disposal differential was 12. What that means was that Richmond got 349 disposals, which is 12 less than their normal average, which is 361. Similarly, in round two, they gave up 328 to Geelong, which seems like a very low number, but it's actually only 15 below Geelong's normal average. And so that's quite an interesting thing, because if you just look at raw numbers here, it looks like Carlton's been really heavily defensive in this game, but they're actually only mildly subduing the opposition. Okay, so the next thing there is the venue differential, and I'll show you where these are plotted on the graph in a moment. So this looks at the MCG, you gave up 349 disposals. What does that mean for that venue? Because we know not all venues give up disposals equally. So 349 is actually 19 below the venue average. You see somewhere like, it's pretty consistent, to be honest. This is probably a good example here. Against the Kangaroos, they gave up 35 extra than the Kangaroos normally get, and that's only 15 more than at Marvel. So while it looks like they were really bad in this round here, Kangaroos, this one, they actually probably weren't as bad as it seems, because you can see here that looks like a very high number of disposals. It's a lot more than the Kangaroos normally get. It's 27 or 35 higher, but it's actually only 15 above that venue. So if we have a look at this graph now, so as I said, the blue lines show disposals conceded. You can see a little bit of it, maybe not so much of a trend with Carlton. These red and green bars show basically relative to the team they've played's average, have they actually kept them below their average or not? So you can see Carlton actually is quite defensive. They keep most teams below their average, aside from Kangaroos, Adelaide and Sydney. And funnily enough, that's every game that they beat the Kangaroos, but they lost those ones. This white line here is the venue average. So you can see here the West Coast game, they've kept them 75 below the average at Optus Stadium. That's not surprising, because I think Carlton had an obscene amount of disposals in that game themselves. And then this purple line here, I'm not sure if it's useful or not, but it's basically the trend of opposition differential. So you can see they started off, and this is actually on the axis over here. So they started off at minus 12.4. They then, by round two, their average was 13.5 below, keeping the opposition 13.5 below the normal average. Then they started to really give up lots of disposals in this space here. And you can see the average actually peaked here at about, what is that, 8.7. So by the end of round four, they were giving up 8.7 more. Then they started to become defensive again, and that average dropped all the way down, and it's basically leveled out now at about 5%. So we've got to be really careful when analyzing statistics that recent form matters, because this whole block here is all a bit random for Carlton. Now, if we have a look at some other teams, you can see some more trends happening, and Kangaroos are a good example of this. They were getting smacked at the start of the year. You can see that their differential average got up to almost 23 by round 7, and since then, they virtually, aside from the Carlton game, they virtually hadn't kept an opposition below their average, and they've pretty much been over the venue average every time. So Kangaroos are giving up disposals. In the last 3 rounds, they've been below the venue average, below the opposition average, and that number's now fallen down to about 10.7. If you look at someone like Geelong, they're ridiculous. Okay, they just keep teams under their average. Do not bet on disposal over. Well, be aware that if your team's playing Geelong are going to heavily restrict the ball. St Kilda, the exact opposite. Now, we know this is interesting because it's a lot of defender stats, but there's only 2 games here that they've kept the opposition below their average. There's only 5 games, which is not too bad, but they're only just below the venue average. You can see here against Adelaide at the Adelaide Oval, against Carlton at Marvel, against Essendon at the MCG, and against Freo at Marvel. They've given up huge numbers. I'm thinking about working this a bit further through as well, where we can dig a bit further into the teams. Bulldogs are another one. We know they're a high disposal team. You can see here they give up a lot of disposals. However, they are actually quite defensive, and on the whole, they're actually restricting opposition disposals by now on the season by 2.6. And if you consider that they got off to a really bad start, coughing up, like in this particular patch here, by round 4, they're averaging about 15, and then they start to bring it down. And now Adelaide at Mars maybe plays with that a lot, because Mars is a really low venue place. I have to see how many games were played at Mars. Why is that minus 50? It must be 2 games at Mars. Let me just quickly check that. ABC. There's only okay. There's only 1 game there. I might have to look into why it's doing that. Because technically that should be equal to 0, but I'll work through that. I think it's actually it's because the Bulldogs got a large number, so that's a little thing I'm going to have to work through. But yeah, basically this is probably a much better way of working out our teams. Look at Port Adelaide is a great example, highly defensive. How defensive are teams, and what is their recent form like? Because that probably matters a lot more than what their season average was. So yeah, something a little bit exciting to look at.